The train wheels screeched against the metal tracks as the sun blazed down on the empty Texas plains. Inside the cramped cargo cars, 200 German soldiers sat in silence. Their uniforms were dirty and torn from weeks of travel across the Atlantic Ocean. They had surrendered in North Africa just 3 months earlier, in the summer of 1943. The Allied forces had crushed Rommel's Afrika Korps, and these men were the survivors. Wilhelm Fischer pressed his face against the small window. He was 42 years old and had been a history professor before the war. Now he was just another prisoner. Outside, he saw endless flat land stretching to the horizon. No buildings, no cities, just grass and dust and occasional clusters of cattle. This was nothing like the America he had imagined. The Nazi propaganda films had shown them factories and skyscrapers and weak city people. This looked like another planet. The train finally stopped at a tiny station. A wooden sign read Dalhart, Texas, in faded letters. The guards opened the doors and sunlight flooded in. The heat hit them like a physical force. It was different from the African desert heat. This was dry and relentless, sucking the moisture from their skin. "Rouse! Rouse!" shouted the American guards, but their accents were strange. The words sounded lazy and stretched out. Wilhelm had studied English at university, but he could barely understand them. The Germans climbed down from the train, their legs weak from the long journey. Wilhelm expected to see regular American soldiers in crisp uniforms. Instead, he saw men wearing dusty jeans, scuffed leather boots, and wide-brimmed hats that looked like they belonged in the Wild West stories. Some had bandanas around their necks. Others had revolvers on their hips, not military pistols, but old-fashioned six-shooters. Young Hans Becker stumbled as he stepped onto the platform. He was only 19 years old and had never left his small village in Bavaria before joining the army. His hands were shaking. An American guard steadied him, and Hans flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, the man just nodded and said something in that drawling accent. "They look like cowboys," Wilhelm whispered to the man next to him. "Cowboys are not real," the other prisoner replied. "They are from children's books." But Wilhelm knew better. As a boy, he had devoured every novel by Karl May, the German writer who created fantastic stories about the American West. He had read about cowboys and Indians, about vast plains and cattle drives, about men who lived by their own code under endless skies. His father had told him those stories were just fantasy, that America was a land of factories and businessmen. Yet here they were, and these men looked exactly like the cowboys from his childhood dreams. The head guard stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that squinted permanently from years in the bright sun. His hat had a sweat-stained band, and his boots had seen better days. "My name is Jack Morrison," he said slowly. "Most folks call me Dusty. You boys are going to be working on my family's ranch while you're here. We got a labor shortage because our men are over in Europe fighting your army. You follow the rules, work hard, and we'll get along just fine." Wilhelm translated for the others. Some of the older prisoners looked angry at the idea of working for the enemy. Lieutenant Vogel, a dedicated Nazi officer, spat on the ground in disgust. But most of the younger men just looked relieved to be alive and out of the war. They marched from the station in a long column. The town was tiny, just a few buildings clustered around the railway. People came out to watch them pass. Some faces showed anger. Others showed curiosity. An old woman made the sign of the cross. A young boy pointed and asked his mother questions. After 2 miles, they reached the camp. It was not what they expected. Yes, there were guard towers and fences with barbed wire. But the barracks were simple wooden buildings that looked recently built. Behind the camp, Wilhelm could see the ranch stretching out for miles. Horses grazed in a corral. Cattle dotted the distant fields. In the background, the war in Europe seemed like a story from another world. That evening, as the sun painted the sky orange and purple, Wilhelm sat on the steps of his barracks. He could hear cattle lowing in the distance. The smell of cooking meat drifted from the cowboys' quarters. Somewhere, someone played a harmonica, a melancholy tune that could have been German or American. Hans sat down next to him. The boy looked lost and scared. "Herr Fischer, what will happen to us?" Hans asked. Wilhelm did not have an answer. Back in Germany, the war was turning bad. The Allies had invaded Sicily in July. The Red Army was pushing back on the Eastern Front. Hamburg had been firebombed in August, killing 40,000 civilians. The news reached them slowly, through whispers and smuggled letters. The thousand-year Reich that Hitler had promised was crumbling after just 10 years. "We will work," Wilhelm finally said. "We will survive. And maybe, just maybe, we will learn something about this strange country." In the guardhouse, Dusty Morrison filled out paperwork by lamplight. His younger brother was fighting in Italy with the 36th Infantry Division. His best friend had died at Pearl Harbor. He had every reason to hate these German prisoners. But his grandfather had immigrated from Bavaria in 1885. The old man had told him stories about leaving everything behind to start fresh in Texas. These prisoners looked tired and beaten, not like the monsters from the newsreels. His foreman, Red Johnson, knocked on the door. "What do you think, boss?" Red asked. "Can we trust them?" Dusty looked out at the barracks where 200 enemy soldiers tried to sleep in a foreign land, thousands of miles from home. "I think they're just men," Dusty said. "Scared men who made bad choices or had choices made for them. We'll see what kind of men they really are come morning." Neither the Cowboys nor the Germans knew it yet, but this meeting would change them all forever. Under the vast Texas sky, where the war seemed both very close and very far away, enemies would become something else entirely. The journey was just beginning. The morning sun had barely risen when the bell rang across the camp. It was October now, and the Texas heat had softened just slightly. Wilhelm Fischer woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors and men groaning as they pulled themselves from thin mattresses. Prison camp life was beginning in earnest. Outside, Dusty Morrison and his crew of cowboys waited with horses and equipment. The ranch stretched over 15,000 acres, and there was more work than hands to do it. The war had taken away most of the young men from nearby towns. Old farmers and cowboys could not handle everything alone. That was why the government had agreed to send German prisoners to work on ranches across Texas and other western states. "All right, boys," Dusty called out in his slow drawl. "We're going to teach you how to be useful. Some of you will work with cattle. Others will fix fences. A few will help with horses. We don't care what rank you had in your army. Here, everyone works the same." Wilhelm translated, watching Lieutenant Vogel's face turn red with anger. The Nazi officer believed in strict hierarchy and discipline. The idea of officers doing common labor alongside enlisted men was an insult. But there was nothing he could do about it. The Americans made the rules now. Red Johnson, a cowboy with Cherokee blood in his veins and a permanent smile on his weathered face, approached young Hans Becker. The boy looked terrified of the horses. "Ever been on a horse, kid?" Red asked. Hans shook his head. In his village in Bavaria, they had used oxen for farm work. Horses were expensive and rare. Red brought over a gentle mare named Sally. She was old and patient, perfect for beginners. He demonstrated how to approach her, how to hold the reins, how to sit in the saddle. His movements were smooth and practiced, like a dancer who had performed the same routine 1,000 times. Wilhelm watched with fascination. This was exactly like the scenes from Karl May's books. He had read Winnetou 3 times as a boy, imagining himself as old Shatterhand riding across the prairie. Now here he was, a middle-aged prisoner of war, about to learn the same skills. The first week was brutal. The Germans had been soldiers, but ranch work used different muscles. Their hands blistered from rope and wood. Their legs ached from hours in the saddle. The sun burned their faces despite their years in North Africa. Several men collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to shade, but something unexpected happened. The cowboys did not mock them or treat them cruelly. When Hans fell off his horse the 3rd time, Red simply helped him back up and adjusted his stirrups. When an older German named Klaus struggled to lift a fence post, a cowboy named Tommy showed him an easier technique. There was no friendship yet, but there was a rough respect born from shared labor. News from the war filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts. In September, the Allies had landed at Salerno in Italy. The fighting was fierce. The Germans defending Italy were some of their best troops. Back in the fatherland, the bombing continued. Kassel was hit in October, hundreds dead. The prisoners listened to these reports with mixed feelings. Some still believed Germany would win. Others had stopped believing in victory, but hoped their families would survive. One afternoon in late October, something changed everything. A massive dust storm appeared on the horizon like a brown wall rising to the sky. Dusty shouted orders, and everyone scrambled to secure the animals and equipment. The storm hit with fury, turning day into night. Sand and dirt filled the air, making it impossible to see or breathe. Germans and cowboys worked side by side in the chaos. Wilhelm found himself next to Dusty, both men struggling to close a gate before the cattle stampeded. The wind tore at their clothes and scoured their skin. They could not speak over the roar, but they worked together instinctively. When the gate finally latched, both men fell against it, gasping for air. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it passed, the ranch looked like a disaster area. Fences were down. Equipment was buried in dirt. 2 calves were missing. But not a single man was seriously hurt because they had all worked together. That evening, something new happened. The cowboys invited some of the Germans to sit by their fire. It was not official, and the guards pretended not to notice. Red Johnson pulled out a flask and offered it to Hans, who took a small sip and coughed. The cowboys laughed, but it was not mean laughter. They remembered being young and trying whiskey for the first time. Someone started singing a cowboy song about lonesome trails and distant homes. The melody was simple and sad. When it ended, Wilhelm began singing a German folk song his mother had taught him. It was about a young man leaving his village to seek his fortune in far lands. The German lyrics meant nothing to the cowboys, but they understood the emotion. Music needed no translation. Tommy, the youngest cowboy, showed them a photograph. His older brother was fighting with the 1st Infantry Division in Italy. He had not heard from him in 2 months. The Germans looked at the photo and saw just another soldier, not so different from themselves. "Your brother," Wilhelm said carefully in his accented English. "He is brave man." Tommy nodded, his eyes wet. Yeah, he is." The moment hung in the air. Here were men whose countries were trying to kill each other, sharing whiskey and songs and worry about brothers and sons fighting far away. War suddenly seemed like the stupidest thing humans had ever invented. Lieutenant Vogel watched from a distance, his face hard with disapproval. That night, he gathered the most loyal Nazis among the prisoners and reminded them they were German soldiers, not farmhands. They must maintain discipline and remember who the enemy was. Some men nodded in agreement, but others, especially the younger ones like Hans, were not so sure anymore. In his quarters, Dusty wrote a letter to his brother in Italy. He told him about the German prisoners working on the ranch. He described how one of them, an older man who used to be a teacher, spoke English well and seemed like a decent fellow. He mentioned the dust storm and how everyone had worked together to save the livestock. "I guess what I'm trying to say," he wrote, "is that maybe the enemy isn't as simple as we thought. These boys are just boys, mostly, scared and far from home, same as you. I still want you to come back safe, and I know you have to fight them over there. But I thought you should know that here, on this little piece of Texas, we're all just trying to get through the day." As October turned to November, the camp settled into a rhythm. Work, meals, rest. Small conversations in broken English and broken German. Shared cigarettes. A nod of respect when someone did good work. The fence of hatred was still there, but small holes were appearing, letting light through. November brought colder winds and harder work. The ranch needed to prepare for winter, and every man was needed. Wilhelm Fischer had learned to rope cattle with surprising skill for a former professor. His hands were calloused now, and his back was strong from weeks of physical labor. He barely recognized himself in the small mirror above his bunk. The war news grew darker as autumn progressed. The Red Army had liberated Kiev in early November, pushing the German Wehrmacht back toward Poland. In the Pacific, American forces had landed in the Gilbert Islands. Here in Texas, these events seemed distant and unreal, like stories from another lifetime. But they were real, and they meant the war was not going well for Germany. Hans Becker had become Red Johnson's shadow. The young German followed the cowboy everywhere, learning by watching. Red taught him to read animal tracks, to sense when weather was changing, to calm a nervous horse with just a voice and gentle hands. They communicated mostly through gestures and simple words, but understanding grew between them anyway. One morning, Maria Gonzalez arrived at the ranch with supplies from town. She was a local woman whose family had lived in Texas since it was still part of Mexico. She spoke Spanish, English, and a little German she had learned from her grandmother. The prisoners looked forward to her visits because she treated them like human beings, not enemies. "How are the boys doing?" she asked Dusty as they unloaded flour and coffee. "Better than expected," Dusty admitted. "That professor fellow, Wilhelm, He's got a natural talent with horses. And the young one, Hans, he works harder than any hand I've had in years." Maria smiled. "Maybe people are just people, no matter which side of a war they're on." Dusty did not answer, but he thought about it all day. The first real crisis came on a cold November morning. The ranch was preparing for a cattle drive to move part of the herd to winter pasture. It was dangerous work even for experienced cowboys. Wilhelm and a dozen other Germans were assigned to help. Everything went smoothly until a young bull decided to break from the herd. The animal was massive and angry, confused by the commotion. It charged toward Hans, who froze in terror. Red was too far away to help. The bull lowered its head, and death seemed certain. Wilhelm did not think. He spurred his horse forward and swung his lasso. The rope caught the bull's horns perfectly, jerking the animal's head to the side. The bull stumbled and fell, and Hans scrambled away safely. The other cowboys rushed in to control the animal before it could get up. Red reached Hans first, checking him for injuries. The boy was shaking but unhurt. He looked at Wilhelm with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." That evening, Red found Wilhelm cleaning his saddle. "That was some fancy roping," Red said, sitting down beside him. "You saved that kid's life." Wilhelm shrugged. "He is just a boy. He should not have been in this war. None of us should." "Your English is getting better," Red observed. "I had good teachers," Wilhelm replied with a small smile. Red pulled out 2 cigarettes and offered one to Wilhelm. They smoked in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was a moment of peace in a world at war, but not everyone was happy about the growing friendship between cowboys and prisoners. In town, some people were angry that Germans were being treated so well. They pointed to news reports about concentration camps and Nazi atrocities. How could anyone be friendly with these men? One night, someone threw rocks through the camp fence with threatening notes attached. "Go back to Hitler and enemy scum," the notes read. The guards increased patrols, and tensions rose. Lieutenant Vogel used this to his advantage. He gathered his loyal followers and preached about German superiority and the temporary nature of their imprisonment. He insisted Germany would still win the war and they would all go home as heroes. Some believed him. Others were not so sure. Wilhelm found himself in an impossible position. He was the translator, the bridge between 2 groups. The cowboys trusted him. The other prisoners looked to him for leadership. But he no longer believed in the cause that had brought him here. Night after night, he lay awake wondering what would happen when the war ended, as it surely would. With Germany defeated in early December, news arrived that made everyone stop and think. The Allies had held a conference in Tehran with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. They were planning the invasion of France for next year. The 3 great powers were united against Germany. Even the most devoted Nazis could see that the odds were impossible. December also brought the cattle drive Wilhelm would never forget. 24 men, cowboys and Germans mixed together, drove 500 head of cattle across 30 miles of rough country to winter pasture. They slept under the stars, ate beans and bacon around campfires, and worked together with the easy cooperation that comes from shared purpose. On the 3rd night of the drive, Wilhelm found himself riding next to Dusty at the back of the herd. The stars above Texas were brilliant, undimmed by any city lights. "Why do you treat us so well?" Wilhelm asked suddenly. "We are your enemies. My country killed your friends at Pearl Harbor. Germans are fighting your brother in Italy right now." Dusty was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "My grandfather came from Germany. From Bavaria, same as that kid Hans. He left because he wanted something better. He found it here, in this big, empty land where a man could start fresh. He taught me that people are complicated. Countries fight wars, but individual men are just trying to survive and do right by their families." "You are a wise man," Wilhelm said. "Nah," Dusty replied. "Just a cowboy who's seen enough of life to know that hate is easier than understanding, but understanding lasts longer." They rode on through the night, 2 men from enemy nations, sharing the quiet companionship of hard work and honest talk. Behind them, the herd moved steadily through the darkness. Above them, the same stars shone on Texas and Germany alike, indifferent to human conflict. When they returned to the ranch 3 days later, Wilhelm felt changed. He had lived a dream from his childhood Karl May novels. He had ridden across the prairie, slept under the stars, and worked alongside real cowboys. But more than that, he had discovered something the Nazi propaganda had never mentioned. The enemy had faces and families and fears just like his own. They were not monsters or weaklings. They were just men, doing their best in difficult times. Hans ran up to him as they dismounted, excited and proud. The boy had completed his first cattle drive. He belonged to something now, even if it was on the wrong side of barbed wire in a foreign land. In a strange way, he was more free here than he had ever been in Hitler's army. That night, as December cold settled over Texas, Wilhelm wrote a letter he knew he could not send. It was addressed to his wife back in Germany, in a city that might not exist anymore. He told her about the cowboys and the cattle and the vast open spaces. He told her he had finally understood what his grandfather meant about America being a land of second chances. He sealed the letter and put it in his footlocker, knowing that someday, somehow, he would find a way to deliver it. Or maybe the war would end, and he would go home and tell her in person. Either way, he needed to remember these days, this place, these unlikely friendships. They were proof that even in the worst of times, humans could still find ways to be decent to each other. Winter came to Texas like an unwelcome visitor. The wind cut across the plains with a cold edge that felt sharper than any European winter Wilhelm remembered. It was December 1943, and the war was entering its 5th year. Christmas was coming, though it seemed impossible to celebrate in a prisoner-of-war camp thousands of miles from home. The work continued despite the cold. Cattle still needed feeding. Fences still needed mending. Water troughs froze overnight and had to be broken open each morning. The Germans and cowboys worked together now with an efficiency born from months of shared labor. The awkwardness had faded. In its place was something like camaraderie, though no one dared call it friendship yet. The war news continued to worsen for Germany. The Soviets had surrounded an entire German army at Korsun in late December. In Italy, the fighting at Monte Cassino was brutal and bloody. American bombers were hitting German cities almost daily now. Bremen, Frankfurt, Berlin itself. The prisoners listened to these reports with growing despair. Many had not heard from their families in months. Hans received a Red Cross letter in mid-December. His hands shook as he opened it. Wilhelm watched the boy's face collapse as he read. His village had been hit during a bombing raid meant for nearby factories. His mother was dead. His younger sister was missing. His father was fighting on the Eastern Front and had not been heard from since September. The boy did not cry. He just stared at the letter, his face empty of all emotion. Red Johnson saw him sitting alone behind the barracks and sat down beside him without a word. They sat together for an hour as the sun set and the temperature dropped. Red did not speak German and Hans barely spoke English. But some things needed no translation. That evening, the Cowboys made a decision that would have gotten them in trouble with the military authorities. They invited the Germans to a small Christmas celebration. It was not official. The guards would look the other way for a few hours. There would be no escape attempts tonight. Everyone knew that. Where would they go? The nearest town was miles away, and beyond that, thousands of miles of hostile country. The celebration was held in the barn, where hay bales provided insulation against the cold. Someone had smuggled in a small Christmas tree. Decorations were simple, made from whatever materials they could find. Paper stars, bits of colored cloth. It looked pathetic and beautiful at the same time. Tommy played his guitar. Red had a surprisingly good singing voice. The Cowboys sang traditional American Christmas songs. Then Wilhelm led the Germans in singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The song had been written in Austria over a century ago, but it belonged to the whole world now. When the Germans sang it in their language and the Americans joined in with English words, something broke inside Wilhelm's chest. He was not sure if it was grief or hope or just exhaustion from carrying hate for so long that a blizzard hit 3 days after Christmas. It came fast and fierce, catching a mixed group of cowboys and Germans far from the main ranch buildings. They were checking on cattle in the northern pasture when the wall of white appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. Dusty made a quick decision. There was a line shack about 2 miles east, a small cabin used by cowboys during long-range work. If they could reach it, they would survive. If not, they would freeze to death. They rode hard through the blinding snow, following Dusty's instinct more than any visible landmarks. Wilhelm stayed close to Hans, making sure the boy did not fall behind. Red Johnson rode at the rear, counting heads to ensure no one was lost. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the dark shape of the line shack appeared through the snow. They crowded inside, 15 men in a space meant for 4. But it was warm once they got the stove going, and there were supplies. Coffee, beans, flour. They would be fine if the storm did not last too long. Dusty had brought a radio, and they huddled around it listening to weather reports. The storm was expected to last at least 2 days. Being trapped together in close quarters with nothing to do but wait changed something. The barriers that had been slowly crumbling finally fell completely. They shared stories about their lives before the war. Dusty talked about growing up on the ranch, learning to ride before he could walk. His grandfather's journey from Bavaria to Texas in 1885. Wait, Wilhelm said, sitting up straighter. What was your grandfather's name? Gunther Morgenstern, Dusty replied. He changed it to Morrison when he got here. Wanted to sound more American. Wilhelm laughed, a real laugh for the first time in months. Morgenstern. Morning Star. My grandmother's family name was Morgenstern. We might be distant relatives. The irony hung in the air. Here they were, possibly related by blood, on opposite sides of a terrible war, trapped together in a tiny cabin while a blizzard raged outside. It was too absurd not to laugh about. Red Johnson shared his own story. His mother was Cherokee, his father Irish. He had grown up between 2 worlds, never quite fitting into either. He understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy for things beyond your control. People in town used to spit at my mother, he said quietly. Called her a savage. Said she should go back to the reservation. My father would get in fights defending her. I learned early that hate is just fear wearing a different face. Hans finally spoke about his village. About his mother who made the best apple strudel in Bavaria. About his sister who wanted to be a teacher. About his father who had been a carpenter before the war came and took all the men away. He cried while he talked, and no one looked away or told him to be strong. They just listened. Tommy shared that his brother had been killed at Anzio in January. The telegram had arrived last week. He had not told anyone because he did not know how to say the words out loud. Now, in this cramped cabin with these unlikely companions, the words finally came. The Germans offered their condolences in broken English, and Tommy accepted them with a nod. Grief did not care about nationality. Lieutenant Vogel was not in the line shack. He was back at the main camp with the hardcore Nazis who still believed in the cause. Wilhelm was glad. Here, in this small space, they could be honest. They could admit that the war was wrong, that it had all been a terrible mistake, that they just wanted it to end so they could go home. On the second night, as the storm howled outside and the stove glowed red, someone suggested they play cards. They gambled with pebbles and buttons, laughing at stupid jokes, forgetting for a few hours that they were supposed to be enemies. Wilhelm taught them a German card game. Dusty taught them poker. Red won most of the hands because he had learned from his Cherokee grandmother who could read faces like books. The radio brought news from the outside world. Soviet forces were pushing deeper into Poland. The Allies were planning something big for the coming year. Everyone knew it. The Third Reich was collapsing, though it might take another year or more. What would happen to the prisoners when Germany surrendered? No one knew. What will you do after the war? Dusty asked Wilhelm during a quiet moment. Wilhelm stared into the stove's flames. I do not know if I have a home to return to. My university was in Dresden. The city has been bombed many times. My wife wrote last year that she was going to stay with her sister in the countryside, but I have not heard from her since May. If she is alive, I will find her. If not, he did not finish the sentence. You could stay here, Dusty said. After the war, I mean. If you wanted. The ranch can always use good hands, and you've learned the work. I could sponsor you for immigration if they would allow it. Wilhelm looked at the American cowboy who might be his distant cousin. The offer was genuine. It was more than that. It was an act of faith in a future where enemies could become friends, where the past could be left behind. I will think about it, Wilhelm said. First, I must know what happened to my wife. The storm broke on the 3rd day. They dug themselves out and rode back to the main ranch, arriving to cheers and relief. They had survived together. That meant something. It meant everything. As January 1944 began, the camp felt different. The Germans were still prisoners. The Cowboys were still guards. But the line between them had blurred. They were men who had faced death together and chosen to trust each other. In a world at war, That was as close to a miracle as anyone could expect. Spring came to Texas in 1945 with wildflowers and cautious hope. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. In Europe, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine in March. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east. In the Pacific, American forces had taken Iwo Jima after brutal fighting. The world was changing, and no one knew what would come next at the ranch. Life continued in its strange rhythm. Wilhelm Fischer had been a prisoner for almost 2 years now. He no longer felt like the same man who had stepped off the train in September 1943. His body was lean and strong from ranch work. His hands were scarred and calloused. He thought in English more often than German now. Sometimes he woke up and forgot where he was, thinking he was just another ranch hand until he saw the barbed wire fence. Hans Becker had grown from a scared boy into a confident young man. Red Johnson had taught him everything about cowboy life. Hans could rope a steer, break a wild horse, and read the weather in the sky. He had found something here that he never had in Germany, a sense of purpose that did not involve killing people. The news came on May 7, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, a suicide in his bunker as Soviet soldiers stormed Berlin. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and left Germany in ruins. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the official announcement. Some men wept. Some sat in stunned silence. A few cheered quietly, relieved it was finally over. Lieutenant Vogel stood rigid and pale, his entire worldview crumbling around him. The Nazi dream was dead, and he had nothing left to believe in. What happens to us now? Hans asked Wilhelm in German. I do not know, Wilhelm replied honestly. We wait. We hope. We pray our families survive. The Cowboys gave them space that day. They understood that even though the prisoners were glad the war was over, they were also mourning. Mourning for their country, their lost years, their friends who died, their families who might be dead. Victory and defeat are simple words, but the reality is always complicated. In the following weeks, information trickled in. Germany was occupied by the 4 Allied powers. Cities were destroyed. Millions were dead. The concentration camps had been liberated, and the world now knew the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done. Some prisoners refused to believe the reports. Others felt sick with shame that they had worn the same uniform as the men who ran those camps. Wilhelm received a letter in June. His hands shook as he opened it. It was from his wife. She was alive, living with her sister in a small village that the war had barely touched. Their apartment in Dresden had been destroyed in the terrible firebombing of February, but she had left before that happened. She was safe. She was waiting for him. He sat down hard on his bunk and cried with relief. Hans found him there and understood without asking. Good news was rare enough to recognize on sight. The American authorities announced that prisoners would be sent back to Germany over the coming months. The process would take time. There were hundreds of thousands of German POWs spread across the United States. Ships were needed to transport them home. Meanwhile, they would continue working where they were. Dusty Morrison came to Wilhelm one evening as the sun was setting. They sat on the corral fence, watching the horses graze in the golden light. My offer still stands, Dusty said. You could stay. Apply for immigration. We'll need good ranch hands to rebuild after the war. You've earned your place here. Wilhelm was quiet for a long moment. My wife is waiting for me. Germany is destroyed, but it is still my home. I must go back and help rebuild, just as you would if Texas was destroyed. Dusty nodded. I understand, but you'll always have a place here if you need it. Your family, cousin. He said the last word with a smile, referencing their shared ancestry they had discovered during the blizzard. What about Hans? Wilhelm asked. That's up to him, Dusty replied. He's young enough to start over. Red's already talked to me about sponsoring him if the kid wants to stay. Hans was torn. Germany was his homeland. But what did he have to go back to? His mother was dead. His sister was missing. His father had not been heard from since 1943 and was presumed killed on the Eastern Front. Here in Texas, he had found something like a family. Red Johnson treated him like a younger brother. The other Cowboys respected his hard work. He belonged here in a way he never had in Germany. I want to go back first, Hans decided after much thought. I need to search for my sister. I need to see what is left of my village. But if there is nothing there, if she is gone, then I would like to come back. To here. To Texas. If that is possible. Red Johnson clapped him on the shoulder. You do what you need to do, kid. But there'll always be a bunk and a saddle waiting for you here. The transfers began in August. Small groups of prisoners were sent to ports on the East Coast to board ships back to Europe. Lieutenant Vogel left with the first group, still bitter and unrepentant. He had learned nothing from his time in Texas. Some men are too rigid to bend, and they break instead. Wilhelm's group was scheduled to leave in September, almost exactly 2 years after he arrived. The night before his departure, the Cowboys threw a farewell gathering. It was not official, but the guards allowed it. There was food and music and stories. They gave him gifts to take home. A horseshoe from his favorite mount for good luck. A lasso he had learned to use so well. A photograph of the whole group, Cowboys and Germans together, taken on the day of a successful cattle drive. You changed my mind about some things, Dusty told him. I thought enemies were simple. You taught me they're just people caught in bad situations. You saved my life, Wilhelm replied. Not from death, but from becoming bitter. You showed me that not all Americans are what the propaganda said. You are better than that. They shook hands, then embraced like the family they might actually be. Hans left a month later. He cried when he said goodbye to Red Johnson. The cowboy gave him his lucky horseshoe and a letter of sponsorship, signed and sealed. You come back when you're ready, Red said. This land has a way of calling people home, even people who weren't born here. The prisoners scattered. Some returned to find their families alive and their homes destroyed but reparable. Others found only graves and ruins. A few, like Wilhelm, found just enough to make them stay in Germany. He became a teacher again, helping to educate a new generation that would never forget what happened when hate took control. Hans returned to Texas in 1947. His sister had died in the final months of the war. His village was a collection of broken buildings and broken people. There was nothing for him there but ghosts. Red Johnson met him at the train station in Dalhart, and Hans knew he was finally home. He became an American citizen in 1952. He married a local girl and had 3 children. He never stopped speaking German, but his kids grew up Texan through and through. He worked the Morrison Ranch until he was too old to ride, then trained young cowboys the same way Red had trained him. Wilhelm and Hans wrote letters for 40 years. They shared news of their families, their joys and sorrows, their memories of that strange time when enemies became brothers under the Texas sky. Every few years, Wilhelm would send a package with German Christmas cookies. Hans would reply with Texas pecans and photos of his growing family. In 1985, Wilhelm finally visited Texas again. He was an old man now, but he could still sit a horse. Dusty was gone, died in 1978. But his children ran the ranch, and they welcomed Wilhelm like the family he was. They rode out to the old line shack where the blizzard had trapped them 4 decades earlier. It was still standing, a monument to the day when men chose understanding over hate. We were enemies, Wilhelm said, looking at the small cabin. And then we weren't, Hans replied, now an old man himself, but still with that same young smile. They stood there in the Texas sun, 2 old men who had been young soldiers in a terrible war. The world had moved on. The war was history now, studied in books and schools. But what they had learned here, on this ranch, in this place, was timeless. People are just people. Countries fight wars, but individuals can choose differently. Hate is easy, but understanding lasts longer. And sometimes, in the most unlikely places, enemies can become family. Behind them, the ranch stretched to the horizon. Cattle grazed in distant fields. Horses ran free in the corral. The land was the same, eternal and indifferent to human conflict. It had witnessed their transformation and would witness countless more. Because this is what the American West had always been. A place where people could start over, where the past could be left behind, where cowboys and prisoners and enemies could all become something better. The sun set over Texas, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Wilhelm and Hans sat on the porch of the ranch house, drinking coffee and watching the day end. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said by the simple fact of their friendship. They were living proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can still break through. That even when countries tell their citizens to hate, individuals can choose love. That even in war, peace is possible between people who have the courage to see each other as human beings first. The night came, and the stars appeared, the same stars that had watched over them during cattle drives and blizzards and quiet conversations 50 years ago. Under those stars, the story that began with enemies on a train platform ended with old friends sharing silence and memories and the knowledge that they had survived not just a war, but the hate that war brings. And that was the greatest victory of all.